So we'll take a look at some of the most ancestral plants and how they originally colonized land. Cyanobacteria and protists might have been on land about 1.2 billion years ago, and we think that the first plants, fungi, animal didn't emerge until about 500 million years ago. So bacteria and protists had the planet to themselves for a long time, until eventually plants figured out how to be terrestrial. Nowadays we find plants in every possible environment except for the most harsh. So we have plants that live on the tops of mountains, we have plants that survive in the middle of the desert, we can even find plants on the polar ice caps. We have plants nowadays like seagrass that live in the oceans and back in aquatic environments, but that's because they have moved from land back to the water. And having plants on land enables other organisms to survive on land. So we think that fungus and plants emerged on land at about the same time, but they provide habitats, they provide oxygen, and they provide sources of food for other things like animal. Plants are most closely related to algae, and we believe green algae. Here we can see plants. The embryophytes are our true plants. And the closest relative to them are the charophytes, which is a type of green algae. And we believe that this is the sister relationship because of the following characteristics that they share. So both charophytes and embryophytes, right here, would have all of these characteristics. They synthesize cellulose in rings inside of the plasma membrane. They have a very similar structure of flagellated sperm. Early plants, like ferns, do actually have flagellated sperm that's similarly to the charophytes. And then they have the formation of a structure called the pharmoblast, which forms when they're doing mitosis, and then eventually forms into a cell wall during cytokinesis. So we believe these green algae actually made it onto land first. So here's the green algae making it onto land. And then eventually diverged into what we would consider plants. Some scientists actually consider the charophytes to be plants as well, but typically that's not commonly accepted. The emergence from the water onto land provides a lot of benefits for an organism that uses photosynthesis. So water filters out sunlight, so being on land means that the plant can get unfiltered sunlight. There's CO2 everywhere in the air, and the soil is very full of nutrients. Unfortunately, it also means a lack of water, which is a problem when you have sperm that need to swim through water, and it means a lack of structural support because now you have to deal with gravity. In aquatic environments, the water helped hold up the structures of the plant, but now it's not going to be the same. So the very first plants on land were actually very short. They kind of spread out widthwise rather than tall. In this first step onto land, the charophytes developed something called sporopollenin. Sporopollenin is a protein that helps prevent desiccation. It's going to enclose the spores and allow them to exist on land without drying out. So the kingdom Plantae, or what we call embryophytes, are typically characterized by 5 shared traits. So these would be 5 shared traits that every plant would share. So plants go through a reproductive cycle called Alternation of Generations. And we saw this in the red or the brown algae, but not the green algae. So this is an example of convergent evolution of this reproductive cycle. So how this works is this is the typical plant that you would see above ground, which is called the sporophyte. And for most groups of plants, the plants that you're seeing are the sporophyte, and this is diploid. They also have a second body that is haploid. So a diploid plant would produce a spore through meiosis, which is how they go from diploid to haploid. So here's meiosis. We're going to create spores. that spore is going to land in some sort of environment and divide by mitosis to develop into a multicellular body. And that multicellular body is called the gametophyte. It's got many cells, but all of those cells are still haploid. Eventually, it's going to use mitosis again to release gametes. So here's my gamete. It didn't have to do meiosis because it's already haploid. And then when two gametes meet from two different plants, we will have fertilization and form a zygote, which is 2N, again, diploid, which will then develop into the sporophyte. So the way to remember this is the gametophyte makes gametes and the sporophyte makes spores. Another characteristic that all plants have is a multicellular dependent embryo. This is such a significant adaptation for plants that it's actually the name that we got for the entire kingdom, which is the embryophytes. Embryophytes literally means embryo plants. So here is the embryo right here. And then this is the maternal plant. So all of this outside of that belongs to the female. And this is adaptive in several ways because it allows for the parent tissue to help protect the budding embryo from the environment. It allows the parent to provide nutrients like sugars and food, and sometimes even have a placental transfer that helps to ensure this transfer of nutrients. Plants also have walled spores in organs called sporangia. So the sporophyte creates spores, and it does so in an organ called a sporangia. Here you can see minim, which is a non-vascular moss, and here's my sporangium organ. And so inside of here, we would have many spores. You can see all the tiny spores that were created by meiosis. These walls also contain sporopollenin, like the green algae, to help make them resistant to harsh environments, meaning dry environments. The green algae also create spores, but they don't have the sporangia. So even though plants and green algae share this protein sporopollenin, only plants have the organs of sporangia. Plants also produce multicellular gametangia, which is gamete bodies. And there are two separate terms for these depending on if it's producing female gametes or male gametes. So a female gametangia is called an archegonia, and a male gametangia is called an antheridia. A female gametangia produces one single non-motile egg, and then a male gametangia is going to release sperm. The sperm typically have to get to the egg, and in our early plants, this is going to be doing so because they have a flagellum and they're going to move through either a liquid environment or a film of liquid. So the sperm actually has to travel from here all the way up to the female gametangia and then into here to fertilize the egg. Once it's fertilized, this zygote is going to develop as an embryo inside of this female gametophyte. So if you think about the resources that plants need to grow, the light and the carbon dioxide are above ground, so they need to grow up, but the water and minerals are in the soil, so they also need to grow down. So apical meristems are an adaptation that allows plants to grow up or down by elongation. So this is the bottom of the root tip here. You can see this is the bottom of the root tip. And this area right here is where the cells are actually doing mitosis. So what happens is these cells divide and then they push the root tip further into the earth. So the plant is only actually growing at the very tips of all of its roots, and those are called the apical meristems. Same thing for the stems. At the very tip of the stems, you can see another apical meristem, and this is where it's going through mitosis to allow the plant to grow up.